And we're rolling. Good. Afternoon to everyone. Okay. The rain has everyone down. Is that it? Good.
This is the funniest day. It rains 10 minutes, then the sun comes out and it rains.
Yeah. If you can't stand the constant rain, you shouldn't be living in Florida.
That's right.
The Sunshine State. So let's get down to work. But before we get into our actual parasha of, thank you, Ekev, I want to revisit something that happened a little while ago. Some of you may recall, ancient history now, that there was a presidential election a little while ago. And during the presidential election, there were numerous blow-ups. What else are you going to talk about? Of different phrasing from the different candidates. There was the blow-up over the phrasing from Mitt Romney from the cocktail party. There was the blow-up that specifically we're going to talk about when President Obama referred to the fact that people who were businessmen and women who had made their own businesses, that they didn't make it themselves. Do you remember this weekly news cycle where this was all the rage of discussion for a bit? Why did that catch so much flack, that statement?
Because it was so clearly untrue.
Because it was so clearly untrue. What do you mean?
You worked your way up for a business. You've done it yourself. You worked your way up. It's been hard.
It's not easy to start a business, is it? It's not easy to make a business successful. It's not easy to come to the top of a field. That is a lot of personal work. So, why did he say it? This is just a case of political disease, foot and mouthitis.
Well, he comes from a different, he views the world with government being the main support system. So he feels that, if there weren't regulations, if there weren't this or that, the business wouldn't make it on its own.
So from his political view, that no independent business person would be able to achieve what they had achieved if there hadn't been the support of a government and a society that made the possibility of their business a possibility. If there hadn't been regulations, if there hadn't been proper taxation to provide for certain things, like roads to deliver your goods on and police to make sure you don't get robbed, if there hadn't been a court system to adjudicate your disagreements over contracts, that there wouldn't be the same fertile ground for business in America that there is. So this statement really did serve, probably unintentionally, because most politicians try to avoid anything controversial if they can help it, probably really did serve as a good place for those two different political philosophies, treated as theologies, to clash. We are not going to settle that debate. But what we are going to do is, hopefully with that in mind, take a look at how the Torah weighs in on a person's and a nation's reflection on what they have accomplished and what that means in the grand scope of the universe. All right? Good. So, chapter 8, which if you are in the Eitz Chaim Chumash, is on page 1039. If you are in any other copy of the Bible, it's going to be Deuteronomy, chapter 8. I get a volunteer? Thank you, Michael. And welcome back from vacation.
Thank you. You shall faithfully observe all the instruction that I enjoin upon you today, that you may thrive and increase and be able to possess the land that the Lord promised on oath to your fathers. Remember the long way that the Lord your God has made you travel in the wilderness these past 40 years, that he might test you by hardships to learn what was in your hearts, whether you would keep his commandments or not. He subjected you to the hardship of hunger, and then he gave you manna to eat, which neither you nor your fathers had ever known, in order to teach you that man does not live on bread alone, but that man may live on anything that the Lord decreed. The clothes upon you did not wear out, nor did your feet swell these 40 years. Bear in mind that the Lord your God disciplines you just as a man Therefore keep the commandments of the Lord your God, walk in his ways, and revere him.
All right. So, why did we take the long way? Why did God let us go hungry for a bit and then give us manna? To teach us something. To teach us something. Okay? The same way that a father would teach or discipline a child. And what were we supposed to learn here? To rely on God. To rely on God. Is that
To obey his commandments.
to obey his commandments. So which is it? Are we learning to obey his commandments, or are we learning to rely on God? He says that you shall faithfully observe all the instructions, the commandments that I've given you today, that you may thrive and increase and be able to possess the land. So what does it have to do with how our feet handle the travel? What does it have to do with being hungry and then getting manna? I mean, couldn't God have just said, here are the laws, do them?
Well, it was a test. It was a test to see if you don't get what you want, will you still obey God's laws?
If you
If you're
don't,
hungry, will you still do what he's told you to?
will you still be willing to follow if you're not getting what you expected? In this case, we're not getting bread, we got manna. And by the way, hopefully you recognize the famous phrase, man does not live by bread alone. Right.
And conversely, if you follow the laws and you get hungry, you can rely on God to feed you.
And you can rely on God when you get hungry if you've been following the laws, that eventually something will come along, whether it be manna like you weren't expecting, or whether it be bread like you were hoping for, something will come along to nourish and sustain you. So is this God telling us to be strong, resolute, and observant? Or is this God telling us, don't worry, no matter what, I've got your back? Or both. Or both. All right, well, let's keep reading and see, because this section ain't done.
For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land with streams and springs and fountains issuing from plain and hill, a land of wheat and barley, with vines, figs, and pomegranates, a land of all trees and honey, a land where you may eat food without stint, where you lack nothing, a land whose rocks are iron, and from whose hills you can mine copper.
All right, pause there. So as opposed to the Midbar, the wilderness of Sinai, where there was nothing, well, next to nothing, we are now moving into the exact opposite of that. We're moving into a land, the land of Israel, where it's just abundance personified. You personifying land? Abundance in every ideal sense of the word. And apparently what we've learned in the wilderness is going to be helpful when we get to this new land. But if what we learned in the wilderness was that, don't worry, God will be there, you can rely on God, how's that going to be helpful in the new land, where there's going to be stuff everywhere? We won't be looking for manna. We'll be able to just farm and produce, and the bounty will be immeasurable.
Well, he's given us laws to follow, so we learn we can trust him there. So it's that then by following his laws, that's a form of trust that we will produce and continue to reap the benefit of everything.
So if we trust God not only in his material providence, that is to say the giving of the food and the water in the wilderness, but if we translate that trust, that if you're willing to rely and trust God for your sustenance, if we transfer that trust to the guidelines that God has given us for a good society and a good life, even if we don't get food immediately from that trust the same way we did in the other category, we might have learned now, well, if I'm willing to trust him for the food, I should be willing to trust him when he tells me how to have a society, how to conduct myself in personal affairs.
Let the land rest every 7 years.
Let the land rest and be trustful in that, which takes a lot of trust.
Yeah, right.
And you don't take things for granted. And the expression of that then would seem to be the next verse.
When you have eaten your fill, give thanks to the Lord your God for the good land which he has given you.
And we exemplify that particular phrase in the mitzvah of Birkat Hamazon. Right. Exactly. As codified in Birkat Hamazon, the verse itself is actually quoted, that you have eaten, you're satisfied, and you will bless. So wait, which one is the blessing for? Which one is the mitzvah? Before or after we eat?
Yes.
Which one is the mitzvah we're talking about here?
After.
After. And not to ruin the surprise, it'll be just in a few minutes, there is no Torah mitzvah. It is not what we call deoraita, to bless before we eat. We do bless before we eat. It's something that was instituted by the rabbis as a logical deduction, not instituted so much as, well, duh, the technical term for a logical deduction, it's the duh moment. But the actual Torah itself only mentions the mitzvah of blessing explicitly, only mentions the mitzvah of blessing after you've eaten.
That makes a lot more sense when you think about
It makes more sense to bless after than before?
Absolutely, because you're thankful for what you have participated in, rather than thanking before you've eaten.
About when or which you're going to eat,
Yeah.
the future.
But is
Makes
someone,
a lot more sense to be thankful.
but is someone
for
more
things that
likely?
you've been given is,
But is someone more likely to, I don't know, offer to wash their boss's car before or after the promotion is filled?
that's
Should
not
you
the
go
same.
before?
It's not the same?
We should do both.
You should do both?
That doesn't work that way.
I've got to go tell John Patrick to wash my car.
Is that his job?
It's not in his job description, no.
He knows he's gonna get
And besides, in Florida, I just leave my car outside and God washes it for me. So,
One is a request and the other is a thank you. It's two different versions.
so one might be the blessing before we eat might be asking for,
Thanking for what's coming, because
Mhm.
I trust that you're going to give it to me.
right?
The other, you've already had it, so of course you want to say thank you for something you've already participated.
I think gratitude is a wonderful feeling that many people don't have.
It's
To
not
be
as
thankful for what you have.
gratitude is perhaps in short supply.
I think so.
I guess we should be thankful we see any at all.
Yeah.
Well, anytime we do a blessing, isn't that an elevation? We were supposed to do 100 blessings a day or
Mhm.
something, and so when we see a rainbow and when we pick up a food, we're elevating just the act of eating, I thought, by doing the blessing. So that's different than the thanking. We're consciously elevating whatever action we're fixing to do by doing the blessing.
So what you're saying is that there's a different intentionality, a different kavanah, we would say in the Hebrew, between the blessing before and the blessing after. But although it may sound or even feel to this point as a thankfulness before and after, that there is a difference between the blessing before and after compared to when you are at someone's house and you say, please may I have a glass of water, and thank you for the glass of water. Those are both roughly equivalent. We just say them on either end of the action. That when it comes to eating, that perhaps there is a different kavanah, different mental state, a different spiritual objective between the blessing before and the blessing after. We will explore that. Michael, keep reading.
Okay. I always like, though, the conditional is, when you have eaten your fill,
Mhm.
and only then.
When you've eaten your fill, which means if I'm still hungry,
Yeah, then you're not supposed, then you don't have to say it right.
we'll get there.
Yeah, there's a measurement.
When we got the hand, well, it's no measurement. We're going to get there.
That's where the size came from, which is.
And it's not actually, we're not measuring Big Macs here, right? It's, let's make sure that we got that clear.
Take care lest you forget the Lord your God and fail to keep his commandments, his rules, and his laws, which I enjoin upon you together. When you have eaten your fill and have built fine houses to live in, and your herds and flocks have multiplied, and your silver and gold have increased, and everything you own has prospered, beware lest your heart grow haughty and you forget the Lord your God, who freed you from the land of Egypt, the house of bondage, who led you through the test you by hardships, only to benefit you in the end. And you say to yourselves, my own power and the might of my own hand have won this wealth for me.
All right, pause there. So what's that final quote that someone might be saying? Because we got a very long list in between of the things that God has done for us up until this point. So it might have gotten a little lost in that long flow. It's not the way we write sentences in English usually. What's that quote? Who would be saying, my own power and might of my own hand have won this wealth for me?
Those who have become haughty.
Those who have become haughty, and they become haughty because they are now enjoying all that the land has offered them. They're enjoying the bounty which is translated into wealth in the ancient world. They're enjoying the foods. They're enjoying the gold and silver that they found when they entered the land of Canaan. They're living in nice houses now rather than the temporary dwellings of the wilderness. And at that time, once you have settled and built yourself a house and you've grown all this food, you would be tempted to say, my own power and might of my own hand has won this for me. And God is saying, don't. And what's the inoculation to keep us from doing that? Remember what God did that. And the mitzvah that then personifies that is the Birkat HaMazon. That the Birkat HaMazon is not just a thank you, God, for what you've given me. It's a thank you, God, because what you've given me has allowed me to survive. That it's not just a, yeah, that was a tasty dinner, my compliments to the chef, but that it is a full-on vaccine against the arrogance that what you enjoy is there because you made it.
Why did we Rebbe's feel that they had to insert a prayer of thankfulness before him when this implores us to just say thank you afterwards?
Okay, so if the Birkat HaMazon was clearly instituted to fulfill this commandment because of the very precise spiritual danger that exactly when a person is feeling most satisfied with themselves is when they are most likely to forget what God did for them, how does that then logically lead us to say, oh yeah, and you have to do a blessing before you've eaten? If it's the very act of being full and happy, not hungry and about to eat, but the full and happiness is the danger. And that's why we have a blessing to take care of that condition. Why would I need to do another blessing before it?
When you're hungry, you're sitting there, food is there, and you're really starving, you still take a moment to stop and remember that this comes from God. When you're hungry, it will be provided too. I mean, you have to work for it, that's on land, but when you're hungry is also to be able to stop. Animals can't stop to do that, as she said before. You elevate the act as well. But to remind yourself, even when you're hungry, you have self-control, and you can stop and make a blessing first, and then dig into the consequences.
So an animal is perhaps less likely to approach the dish or the food that they've caught for themselves and reflect on where it came from, and instead just chow in. All right, well, let's take a look at a few sources that deal with this, this issue, this spiritual danger, and the medicine provided to prevent its worsening condition. And the first section that we're going to look at is actually going to deal with this question of being satisfied. So after all, if the only time we have to thank God is when we are satisfied with what we've just eaten, some of us might go through the entire life without ever seeing Birkat HaMazon. Either because we've never had enough, if you live under such dire poverty that you never have a fulfilling meal because you're always on the brink of starvation, then you probably never feel satisfied after a meal. Or on the other hand, if you are someone who always wants more and more and more and more, then you also don't feel satisfied when they take the buffet cart away from you. So what do we do with this? Do we just leave it up to the individual? Well, thankfully our sages have tried to give us some guidance. Would someone like to read the first paragraph there from Sefer HaChinuch? All right.
Now for this satisfaction, there is no uniform measure for every person. but everyone knows his own safety.
So, very true, right? What satisfies you may not satisfy me, and what satisfies me may not satisfy you.
We know the measure for a righteous person, which is when he eats to the satisfaction of the Spirit, by which I mean only enough for his sustenance.
However, if we were going to provide a rule of thumb for what should be the righteous measure of satisfaction, then you should be eating as much as is actually necessary for your sustenance. You shouldn't be eating so much just out of gluttony or, too much. You should eat to live.
The sages were strict, however, and said the blessing even over the amount of an olive and egg.
But the Hachamim, the sages, said, yes, that would be the minimum measure of when you say the Birkat HaMazon, which is if you are absolutely satisfied. However, in order to make sure that people will say the blessing more often and recognize the truth behind the blessing, which we'll continue to discuss, we are going to tell people that they should they should say the blessing even if all they've eaten is as small as an egg or an olive. An olive actually turns out to be the practical definition, but quoting, I try to stay true to the text. So even if you've only had an olive's worth of bread, you say Birkat HaMazon.
But olives were different sizes then.
Well, actually, olives were not different sizes then. That's a much longer discussion, which becomes much more of practical concern during Pesach, when you see people trying to eat an entire shmura matzah to fulfill the mitzvah of achilat matzah, of the eating of matzah. And we actually know exactly how big olives were back then, because we have olive trees that were planted back then that are still producing fruit. So some olive trees are indeed thousands of years old, and they still bear fruit. It's a miracle of creation. And we know how big their olives are. And there is no substantial difference between their olives and the olives today. So maybe some interesting hypothesis that came during the Middle Ages by rabbis who had never seen an olive in their life, to try and figure out how big an olive really was. And they erred on the side of overinflation when it came to an olive size. Okay, so what are we trying to actually say about all of this? Well, keep going.
If it enters your mind to say, it was my power and strength, recall who granted you strength.
So Ibn Ezra, the great commentator from the Middle Ages, says in that very last line that we read, my own power and my might of my hand have won this wealth for me, that the Birkat HaMazon, meant to exemplify what God is discussing in this passage, is trying to remind us of what more fundamental truth that we might have forgotten in our struggle to achieve what we have won. What's the fundamental truth?
It wasn't us, it was God.
Well, it wasn't that I did nothing,
No.
but all that I accomplished with the tools that God had given me. For a farmer to say, look what I have grown, and ignore the fact that the land was given to him by God, is to ignore a rather important component of what was achieved. It is very natural, it is very logical for us to focus on our own efforts, our own work, our own labor. After all, that's what we have control over, and rightly so. And we should be proud of our accomplishments. But what the Birkat HaMazon and this whole passage is trying to argue against is the tendency to focus on our own contribution to the outcome, to the exclusion of what God gave us to begin with.
And I know here in Florida, you've had some years with tremendous droughts.
Mhm.
And if the rain isn't coming, you can work as hard as you want. You have to think even, so
Absolutely.
when you finally get the crops, be thankful.
When you finally get the crops, be thankful. Or even if you're not a farmer, when you're eating the crops, and be thankful that somewhere, somehow, the world is still able to produce food. And it's through, yes, the work and the effort of many, many millions of people around the world that give us the comfortable lifestyle that many of us enjoy in this country. But it's because of this world that those farmers are able to do those things. Which leads us to the next quote from, this is a commentator on Ibn Ezra.
When I hear one deniers of the faith saying that this is the natural order, he asked them who created the natural order, and and who set its foundations.
All right, so Avi Ezer, who, like I said, is a commentator on Ibn Ezra, says whenever somebody talks to me about, the fact that, well, having ground that produces food, that's just the natural order of things. So you can't thank God that your field produced wheat. Of course your field produced wheat. You put wheat seeds into it. That's no miracle. There's nothing to thank God for there. That's just what happens to fields when you put that seed in it. And his answer to such a question is?
Who created the laws of physics?
And who created the laws that allowed that to happen in the first place? Who made it possible? Who put the decimal point, in the equations of the universe that actually allowed for human existence to be something that could emerge? That to believe that the miracle of God's providence is only seen in the giving of manna or other, dramatic miracles that have no parallel in the natural order that we see day to day, is to deny one of the most fundamental tenets of Torah, which is God didn't only create the miracles, God created the natural order which exists in between all the miracles, that which makes the miracle stand out, the universe itself, with all of its laws, rules, and various chemical, biological, and physical underpinnings, everything from the cycle of rain and water and evaporation and all of those good things, to the way that bodies are able to process nutrients which are essentially grown because of the composition of our dirt coupled with the energy of a star millions of miles away. You don't think that's a pretty amazing process to have set up? that we can, everything that we are eating is essentially fueled by a star, which is really just one giant controlled explosion? That's pretty amazing. And to believe that we should deny God's part in what we've accomplished only because it's the natural order of things is to forget that the natural order of things didn't have to be the way they are. That the rules could have been written elsewise, at which point we wouldn't exist, or our existence would be much harder than it already is. Yes? No? Maybe so? Okay. So, let's get down to then, now that we understand, sort of, why we're saying a blessing after, what logic the rabbis use for putting a blessing before. Okay?
If when one is full, one says a blessing. When one is hungry, is it not all the more so that one says a blessing?
Basic logic, 101. If I should be thankful when I'm full, then when I'm hungry and I got food in front of me, all the more so, I should feel thanks. Right? Make sense? Yes, of course. I haven't eaten yet, so that thanks may be a bit rushed. As my mother taught me, that is probably why the rabbis made sure that the blessing before we eat is a lot shorter than the blessing after we eat. Because it's a lot more likely that people are willing to say a sentence between them and their food than it is for them to say a whole bunch of paragraphs after their food. Okay. But that's not the only explanation that our sages give for doing a blessing before we eat. They try to drive home this lesson a little bit more deeply.
It is forbidden for someone to derive benefit from anything in this world without reciting a blessing. And whoever derives benefit from this world without reciting a blessing, thereby commits sacrilege.
All right. Basic proposition the rabbis are examining here. No one is allowed to enjoy anything without saying a blessing beforehand. And if you enjoy it, you have committed sacrilege. That's pretty rough. I'm not allowed to enjoy myself without saying a blessing first? Why not? Well, before we get to the why not, let's figure out what we do to fix it if we happen to have already done this, which would have been as common in their day as ours.
What is this remedy for doing so?
I.e., what happens if you have eaten something or enjoyed other aspects of this world that demand a blessing without a blessing? What do?
Let the person go to a sage. If he goes
What? You got to get a little bit more intonation here. Let a person go to a sage. Wow, what is that? What if he goes to a sage? What will that do for him? All right, the Talmud trots out notions and then has to explain them. So it's okay to have a few moments of outrage in the middle of what we call the sugya, middle of the section of Talmud. So it says, go to a sage. And if I were to tell all of you, if you forgot to say a blessing before you ate something, you need to go talk to your rabbi, your answer would be, well, why? What's he going to do? He going to wave his magic Torah wand and then make my sin go away? But why do I have to go see a rabbi just because I forgot to say a blessing?
Oh, yeah.
I have a long line outside. Well, maybe that's not such a bad idea. But let's see how they actually mean, what they mean by go to a sage.
Lo, the man has already violated the prohibition. Rather, said Rabbah, let him go to a sage to begin with, so that he will teach him the requisite blessings to be recited, so that one will not come to commit sacrilege.
All right, so rather than meaning if you've already transgressed, you should go to a sage because he can fix that transgression, which is not true. That's something that you fix by doing tshuva between yourself and God, by repenting. Instead, when they say go to a sage, what they mean is if you realize that you've eaten without saying a blessing, go to a sage so you can learn the proper blessing. And that way, next time, you will not commit that transgression. So if you're making problems, you're having trouble, study. Figure out the right way to do it. Right? It'd be like saying, if you have an accident, go to driving school. That's not going to actually fix your previous accident, but it will hopefully prevent you from having more accidents. Make sense? Reasonable advice. Okay, but let's get back to this idea of blessing before benefit. Keep going.
Said Rabbi Judah, said Samuel, whoever derives benefit in this world without reciting a blessing is as if he derived benefit from holy things that belong to heaven, and so has committed sacrilege. For it is said, the earth belongs to the Lord, and everything that fills it.
All right. So now we have a proof text for what we mean by deriving benefit is without blessing is sacrilege. If the entire world belongs to God, the same way that a sacrifice that has been dedicated for use at the temple but has not yet been sacrificed belongs to God, then if I use that sacrifice, if I eat it just for lunch rather than actually taking it to the temple and sacrificing it, then I have essentially stolen from God and eaten something that was holy that I should not have done. We got that basic scenario, right? Something that's been dedicated for God but has not actually been brought as a sacrifice. If you use it for a mundane purpose, like lunch, then you have committed a sacrilege. You have violated the standards of holiness. Well, if everything in the world belongs to God a priori, those great Latin terms, which means before they even come into existence, already at the moment that they are there, they belong to God by default, then if I use it without a blessing, it's the equivalent of stealing something from the temple, stealing from something that belongs to God.
It also seems to be very much like going into a store and paying for the thing before you take it out of there. You don't just walk into the dollar store, take anything you want and walk out. You pay for it. This is sort of a way of paying God for what he has given you.
For paying God for what not he has given you, but what already belonged to him. And that's the fundamental point that they're saying here, which is, to use your analogy, when you walk into the dollar store, everything in the store belongs to the store.
That's right.
And doesn't belong to you until you've actually paid. It is their property. And when you look around this world, everything, until you've said a blessing over it, belongs to God. Even if it's already in your fridge, even if you've already cooked it, it belongs to God until you've said the blessing. This logic making sense? We can talk about the spiritual side of it in a moment, but making sure that we're following this idea that everything in existence belongs to God. Question or just a hiccup?
So, taking it further, if everything belongs to God, that substance is infinite as God is, and your blessing brings it to the final, so that you can consume and grow nourishment
So how can I take something from God? I mean, even with a blessing, right? If God is infinite and therefore God's possessions are infinite, how can I translate that to the finite, to me, to my use? Well, let's get to the next side. And we'll see that there's an inherent contradiction in this verse with another verse that you might be familiar from Hallel.
Rabbi Levi contrasted verses of Scripture. It is written, the earth belongs to the Lord and everything that fills it. And it is written, the heaven belongs to the Lord, but the earth he has given to men.
All right, so what's the contradiction?
There is no
No, we'll get to the we'll get to the resolution in a moment. But remember, you got to live with the tension for a while before the resolution actually feels like a release. If you just read through the words of our sages as though it were a novel, you never experience the roller coaster of emotion and learning and the spiritual journey. It'd be like if someone were to write out a whole murder mystery by telling you at the very beginning who actually did it and then just explaining to you how the detective figured it out. That there's no tension. And therefore, when you actually get to the whodunit, there's no release. And the sages want us to understand that having that tension, having that misunderstanding, that moment of doubt, of lack of clarity, is good. Because then it can be resolved. And to just pretend like there's never a doubt, pretend like there's never anything that niggles at the back of the mind as a contradiction of, wait a minute, didn't we read a verse somewhere that said the opposite of that? Pretending like none of that existed is not what Judaism advocates. You embrace it, you hold it, then you resolve it.
The other thing which I find fascinating is this discussion which we read here in the hour took place among the sages over hundreds of years.
Yeah.
They weren't all sitting in the same room talking about this.
Correct.
This guy says it 100 years later, somebody else writes a comment on it, and 20 years later somebody else does. So it actually...
And 2,000 years later, so do we.
So do we.
Exactly. This is an ongoing conversation.
But even in the Talmud, it took 300 years to write that.
Absolutely.
So the tension was there all along until somebody comes up with another idea and says, wait a minute, there's another verse.
Well, the first tension, of course, was created when the two verses were first written. And it took a few very wise people to notice the tension, and then it took other wise people to help find us a resolution. All right, so now that we've lived with that tension long enough, Marian, give us the resolution.
But there is no contradiction. The former verse refers to the case before one has recited the lesson, and the latter verse refers to the case after one has recited the lesson.
Okay. So yes, they are both true verses. Everything belongs to God, earth, heaven, everything. And God has given us the earth. What does that mean? Before we say a blessing, everything is in God's domain. After you say a blessing, well, that is the vehicle by which God has given you the right to then use some of his creation for yourself. You now have access. The equivalent, as Harriet mentioned, of paying the cashier before you take the merchandise out. That transfers the right of usage to you. Now, you may notice I'm using the term right of usage. Judaism never really has a notion of 100% absolute ownership of anything. God gives us the right to use this world as we follow Torah, as we live the life according to the mitzvot. If we don't, it doesn't matter how much you paid for it. It doesn't matter what you did to make it or earn it. It's not yours. It belongs to God until you have done what was necessary to transfer the usage of that to you, temporarily, since all life is temporary. Okay? I know that's a bit of a radical notion for some of our thinking in this country, where we like clear lines of ownership, but this Torah was not written by a capitalist any more than it was written by a communist. Okay, keep going.
Said Rav Hanina Bar Hak, whoever derives benefit in this world without reciting a blessing is as if he bugged the Holy One, blessed be he, and the community of Israel.
All right, so what do we add here? Not only are you in trouble vis-a-vis God for enjoying something of this world without saying a blessing, but we've now added the community as well. So not only did you mug God by taking something without having got the permission that a blessing confers, but you have also attacked the community of Israel. Let's see the proof text for this.
For it is said, whoever robs from his father or mother and says, it's no transgression, is the companion of a destroyer. And father refers only to the Holy One, blessed be he, as it says, is not he your father who has gotten you?
Okay, so you understand the basic verse from Proverbs, that if you steal from your mother and father and say, well, that doesn't count as stealing, is a companion of the destroyer, meaning you're like one of the worst, and that most categorically certainly is stealing, and in fact it's a worse form of stealing than stealing from a stranger. Although I know many youngsters probably think that taking $5 out of mom or dad's purse or wallet is not such a big deal. It is a big deal. And here they are using the word father as a stand-in for God. And mother then, keep going.
Mother refers only to the community of Israel, as it says, hear my son, the instruction of your father, and do not forsake the teaching of your mother.
Also from Proverbs, here using the parallel of father and mother. And father, we already said, is referring to God. And then what teachings would we be looking for in addition to the teachings of, in quote, God, would be the instruction of the community. And so to eat without a blessing is to violate both divine law and communal norms.
I just want to note that Deuteronomy 32:6 actually says, is not he your father who created you? That gotten thing is a little bit.
Yeah, I know. The translation sometimes can be a little clunky.
Because it's true, God created you, so
Yes.
you have to thank him for, that's right. I like
You like the form created better.
created, makes it much clearer what you mean, what it means here.
Well, JPS, which is the translation that's used in the Eighth Time, is very good at making things clear, but sometimes they make it too clear. And their clarity can often be more interpretation than a translation which allows some of the bumpiness of the Hebrew to remain. So it's good for the purposes here to make things clear, but not necessarily always the best form. So, but well spotted, and thank you for looking that up. Okay. Which blessing did we start with in the Torah? The one after, the Birkat Hamazon. Which blessing have we spent the most time and the most ink in the Talmud and other discussions? The one before. Wait a minute. The Torah spends all of these pages trying to argue against arrogance and against this sense of self-importance, that I did this, I'm a self-made person, I accomplished all of this, and look at how wonderful I am, and all of that, by focusing on the Birkat Hamazon. After you've eaten and after you've been satisfied, then you should bless. And yet the Talmud is spending an awful lot of time on the blessing before we eat. Why? Well, let me ask you this. If a teacher has two students in class, and one student has already mastered the material, and the other student is still struggling, which one does the teacher spend more time with? The one who is struggling. Which mitzvah is clearly defined in the Torah? The Birkat Hamazon, the blessing after. As such, the sages did not need as much effort to explain the spiritual need of Birkat Hamazon. They do spend a fair bit of time explaining when you say it and how you say it, and the zimun, the invitation for others to join with you in it, and how it was constructed, and which sage added, or which, I shouldn't say sage, but which the different members of the story of the Tanakh added different paragraphs to it. But the why they say it is already explained very clearly in Torah. And the why we say the blessing before, well, that's deduced. And when you deduce something rather than point to a clear and lengthy explanation in the Torah, you've got to back it up. And you're going to have to try and help everyone else to understand what is meant by it. And so, in fact, the reason the sages are spending so much more time on the blessing before rather than the blessing after isn't that the blessing before is more important. It's that the blessing before needs more support in order to convince and pull others in. As Malka said right at the beginning, well, actually the blessing after, that makes a lot of sense. And indeed, I think once someone has learned a little Torah, once someone has seen what the Torah says about this, they would agree with you. Which leaves them still saying that blessing before, on the other hand. And so the rabbis are trying to drive home multiple reasons, whether it be for God, whether it be for the community, whether it be because it's only logical to thank before rather than thanking after, to thank while you're hungry rather than thank when you're full, or whether it's because everything is sacred and to take it as an act of sacrilege. They are coming up with multiple explanations and reasons to try and motivate us to make sure we actually take that 15 seconds to say a blessing before we start shoving food in our mouth.
This might be a little bit off the wall, but last parsha we read, do not add or subtract
Mhm.
from the Torah, so they created a blessing here, which is not mentioned. Could somebody argue, well, you're adding?
Could somebody argue? A wonderful hypothetical. The answer is, of course, people can argue about everything, and people have argued about everything. And indeed, the underlying question of, aren't the rabbis adding to Torah by giving us a blessing before we eat? The answer within Judaism, within the rabbinic view of the world is, well, of course not. For two very good reasons. And reasons which I do think stand up to outside scrutiny from a fair and impartial judge. From people that have an axe to grind, yeah, there's no such thing as a good enough explanation. But from a fair and impartial judge, we can explain, look, the Torah doesn't explain every detail of every observance of every mitzvah. The Torah is a short book. And as such, it is our responsibility, and indeed the Torah even outlines that it's going to be necessary, for us to try and understand and explain and learn into the text all of those details. We have to wrestle with the text and find out the implications. So to look at the Psalms and say, the world belongs to God and the world belongs to men, and to try and figure out how to reconcile that, and to come to the conclusion that that's trying to teach us that we need to bless in order to transfer from the category of God to the category of man, is a reasonable way to try and figure out what those words mean. And it's not adding to the Torah, it's taking what is embedded in the Torah and making it explicit. The other explanation is for things that are not as clearly derived from the text is that the text of Deuteronomy itself also gives us the responsibility and authority to implement Torah in ways that fit the life that we are living. It doesn't mean that Torah becomes a tool of convenience, God forbid, but it does mean that from time to time, interpret or perhaps even implement a temporary, another type of behavior in order to make sure that Torah itself as a whole can be observed. So to give you a very clear example, you get married and you're standing under that chuppah, also have a document called a ketubah. Any one point in the Torah where it says we need a ketubah? No, the Torah does not say you need a ketubah. However, the rabbis noticed at the time that the ketubah was instituted that women were being subjected to an extremely unfair result of the economic structure they lived in, which is if a woman was married and then divorced, or married and her husband died leaving no children, or leaving children from another wife only, or leaving children that were just rotten, she had no means of support. Already left her father's household, she was now living in his household. Under Jewish law, because of the laws of inheriting land, she would not inherit from her husband when he died, and she had no claim on his land in the Torah in the case of divorce. So she would be left potentially a penniless widow or divorcee. And the rabbi said, that's not fair. So what did they institute? They instituted the ketubah. They said in order to make sure that marriage, which is 100% important Torah value, can still be maintained, and in order to make sure that it can be fair, which again is 100% Torah value, we will make people who want to get married in our communities have to sign a document which promises that the woman will be looked after in the case of divorce or death. And that's the way it's going to be from now on. They didn't claim to find that explicitly in the Torah, but they did claim that in order for Torah to survive, and the values of Torah to survive, a little addition was needed, and to make that work. And that addition is now what we call a ketubah. Does that sort of make sense? Okay. All right. Let's finish off with our final text here to come back to the notion of blessing.
You must understand that when we continually say, blessed are you,
Which in Hebrew would be Baruch Atah, right? The beginning of almost every blessing.
the meaning is clearly not to add blessing to the one who has no need of any addition, perish before.
Right. So when we say, blessed are you, we are not actually saying God is more blessed now than he was before I said this term. Does it make sense? Right? We might be tempted to think that when we bless God, that it's somehow the reciprocal of when God blesses us. Right? When we are blessed, when we say, I've been blessed, yada, 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 a new job, a happy family, whatever it might be that we're calling our blessing, we mean something in my life has been increased for the better. Right? Isn't that usually what someone means when they say, I've been blessed? Do not think, when we say, blessed are you, Baruch Atah, for God, that we are saying anything similar. We're not saying that God is more blessed now than he was a moment ago, or than he was a week ago. So what are we saying?
The term blessed is an adjective. In other words, an avowal to him that he contains all blessing.
Instead, when we say, blessed are you, we're not saying you've been blessed. We say, you are what blessing is. You are the source of all blessing. You are that which creates blessing. In fact, you are that which creates the blessing, the goodness, that we are now about to enjoy. And so, as such, we will say a blessing, not to make it blessed, but to acknowledge the blessing that it is. How does that work?
You're making it from a verb to an adjective.
Exactly. Exactly.
Which is quite interesting.
Well, I'm not. Our tradition is, but yes.
Yeah, but
Yes.
when you think about it, yeah.
So to go back to Nikki's proposition before, would I say that when we give a blessing, we are raising something up? I would say the answer is no and yes. We're not raising up the thing about which we are saying the blessing. We are raising ourselves up by acknowledging the blessing that thing already is, and the source of that blessing in God. No matter how far removed God's hand may seem to be in that part of the world that we are about to enjoy.
Just in time.
And we got the musical interlude to finish off with. All right, take care, everyone, and keep having a blessed life, and I hope you notice.
Oh, no.